Most people experience the world through noise. Headlines, breaking alerts, political statements, warnings between leaders. Sudden market moves and endless commentary dominate attention. Noise feels urgent because it demands reaction. It gives the impression that the most important events are the loudest ones. In moments of global uncertainty, this instinct becomes even stronger. People want clarity, direction, and reassurance, so they focus on what is being said rather than what is quietly changing underneath. Michael Burry approaches uncertainty differently. He does not try to predict the next headline, the next escalation, or the next dramatic event. Instead, he watches how systems behave when they are placed under stress. He pays attention to where assumptions quietly accumulate and where those assumptions could fail if conditions shift. This difference in perspective is subtle but critical. Events do not cause damage on their own. Damage happens when an event exposes weaknesses that already existed. Periods of geopolitical tension often create the illusion that markets are responding to politics directly. In reality, politics usually act as catalysts rather than causes. The deeper forces are structural. Debt levels, leverage, liquidity, behavioral incentives, and concentration of risk determine how markets absorb shock. Burry understands that noise rarely changes structure, it only tests it. This is why he ignores what leaders say and focuses instead on what systems rely on. When people react emotionally to geopolitical developments, they often miss the more important question: what breaks if this situation lasts longer than expected? Many systems are built to function under normal conditions, not prolonged uncertainty. They depend on constant liquidity, steady confidence, and predictable behavior. When those conditions weaken, fragility begins to surface. Fragility does not appear suddenly. It builds gradually during periods of stability and confidence. When markets operate smoothly for extended periods, participants become comfortable. Risk is assumed to be manageable and complexity is underestimated. This comfort creates blind spots. The longer stability persists, the less attention is paid to how systems might behave outside of ideal conditions. Burry's focus on fragility reflects an understanding of this pattern. He looks for areas where success has been uninterrupted, where assumptions have not been challenged, and where participation has become automatic. These are often the places where risk is least visible and therefore most dangerous. When everyone believes something is safe, that belief itself becomes a vulnerability. Global uncertainty amplifies this effect. As political tensions increase, attention shifts toward dramatic narratives. Markets become preoccupied with short-term reactions rather than long-term exposure. This creates a paradox. The louder the noise becomes, the less attention is paid to the quiet buildup of structural weakness. Burry's approach cuts through this distraction. Instead of reacting to fear, he studies how fear might interact with existing weaknesses. One of the most misunderstood aspects of market stress is the role of panic. Panic does not create fragility, it reveals it. When panic spreads through a system that is resilient, the effects are limited and temporary. When panic spreads through a system that is fragile, the consequences are disproportionate. Prices move rapidly, liquidity evaporates, and assumptions collapse. Burry's focus is not on predicting panic, but on identifying where panic would have the greatest impact if it occurred. This perspective requires patience. It also requires resisting the pressure to participate in collective anxiety. During noisy periods, markets reward confidence and decisiveness. Caution can appear passive or overly conservative. However, Burry's history suggests that restraint is often more effective than reaction. He waits for moments when fragility becomes undeniable, not when fear is loudest. Another important aspect of this approach is understanding comfort. Comfort is not safety. Comfort is familiarity. Markets often mistake the two. Assets, strategies, and narratives that have worked consistently create a sense of security even when underlying conditions change. Burry remains skeptical of comfort because it discourages questioning. When participants stop asking why something works, fragility begins to build. Geopolitical complexity increases the importance of this skepticism. As relationships between major powers become more uncertain, systems face pressures that are difficult to quantify. Supply chains are disrupted, capital flows shift, and trust becomes conditional. These changes do not always cause immediate damage, but they alter the environment in which systems operate. Burry observes these shifts not as isolated events, but as part of a broader pattern of stress accumulation. Rather than focusing on outcomes, he studies dependencies. What requires constant growth? What assumes uninterrupted liquidity? What depends on confidence remaining intact? These dependencies are rarely discussed during calm periods, but they become critical during uncertainty. Systems that rely on continuous expansion or stable expectations are inherently fragile when those conditions are challenged. The tendency to focus on headlines during uncertainty reflects a desire for control. Headlines offer a narrative, even if it is incomplete. Structural fragility offers no such comfort. It requires accepting uncertainty and complexity. Burry's approach embraces this discomfort. By looking away from noise, he gains a clearer view of where systems are vulnerable. This is not about predicting collapse. It is about understanding exposure. Exposure determines how systems respond to stress. Markets do not move uniformly. They react unevenly based on underlying strength and weakness. Burry's attention is drawn to areas where strength is assumed rather than demonstrated. As global uncertainty persists, the gap between noise and fragility becomes more significant. Noise changes daily. Fragility accumulates over time. Those who focus exclusively on noise risk being unprepared for structural shifts. Those who study fragility may appear inactive, but they are often better positioned when conditions change. At this point, the conversation naturally shifts. Once fragility is identified, the question is no longer about avoiding uncertainty, but about understanding how systems behave within it. This leads to a deeper perspective on risk, one that does not rely on predictions or dramatic reactions. Understanding fragility requires stepping back from immediate events and observing patterns over time. Systems reveal their weaknesses not during calm periods, but when they are tested repeatedly. Prolonged uncertainty functions as such a test. It exposes assumptions that were never designed to be challenged simultaneously. Michael Burry's focus remains on these pressure points rather than on surface-level reactions. In environments dominated by noise, speed is often mistaken for intelligence. Rapid responses create the illusion of control. However, speed without understanding increases vulnerability. Burry's restraint allows him to observe how stress propagates through interconnected systems. He watches how confidence erodes, how liquidity tightens, and how behavior changes when comfort is removed. One of the most important lessons from this perspective is that fragility is often invisible to those who benefit from stability. Participants embedded within a system may not recognize its weaknesses because those weaknesses have not yet been tested. This is why fragility often surprises markets. It exists long before it is acknowledged. Burry's approach challenges the idea that risk can be eliminated. Instead, it emphasizes that risk can be misunderstood. Markets frequently misprice risk by focusing on probability rather than impact. Low probability events are dismissed, even when their potential impact is significant. Fragile systems amplify impact, turning unlikely events into major disruptions. Global political tension increases this risk asymmetry. While specific outcomes remain uncertain, the range of possible disruptions expands. Systems designed for narrow ranges of outcomes struggle when those ranges widen. Burry watches for signs that systems are being stretched beyond their design parameters. Another critical element of fragility is concentration. When exposure becomes concentrated in certain areas, those areas become points of failure. Concentration can take many forms: capital allocation, narrative dominance, or behavioral alignment. When too many participants rely on the same assumptions, divergence becomes dangerous. Burry pays attention to where consensus is strongest, not because consensus is wrong, but because it often masks shared vulnerability. This approach also reframes the concept of safety. Safety is not the absence of volatility. It is the ability to endure volatility without structural damage. Systems that suppress volatility may appear stable, but they often accumulate hidden stress. When volatility returns, the release is abrupt. Burry's focus on fragility acknowledges this dynamic. During uncertain times, many investors seek protection by retreating into familiar frameworks. They look for assets or strategies that feel defensive. However, familiarity does not guarantee resilience. Burry's skepticism extends to defensive narratives that rely on historical behavior without accounting for changing conditions. Fragility arises when history is assumed to repeat without adjustment. Noise encourages short-term thinking. Fragility demands long-term observation. This tension shapes how different participants experience uncertainty. Those focused on noise may feel informed but unprepared. Those focused on fragility may feel uncertain but aware. Burry aligns with the latter. As geopolitical complexity persists, uncertainty becomes a constant rather than an exception. This changes how systems should be evaluated. Temporary stress can be absorbed. Sustained stress reveals design flaws. Burry's attention to sustained pressure reflects an understanding that modern systems are not only complex, but also tightly coupled. Small disruptions can propagate widely when buffers are thin. Ultimately, ignoring noise does not mean ignoring reality. It means prioritizing the aspects of reality that determine outcomes. Noise describes events, fragility describes consequences. Burry's approach recognizes that the most significant risks are often those that remain unspoken because they are inconvenient or uncomfortable. In this context, uncertainty is not something to be resolved quickly. It is something to be managed thoughtfully. Systems that adapt gradually tend to survive prolonged stress. Systems that rely on confidence alone do not. Burry's focus on fragility highlights this distinction. As attention shifts away from headlines and toward structure, a clearer picture emerges. Fragility is not evenly distributed. Some areas are resilient, others are brittle. Understanding this distribution is more valuable than reacting to daily news cycles. This perspective does not eliminate risk, but it reframes it. Instead of asking what will happen next, it asks what matters if something happens at all. That question leads to deeper insight and reduces surprise. Surprise, more than volatility, is what causes lasting damage. Michael Burry's approach offers no certainty, no predictions, and no comfort. It offers something more useful: awareness of where systems are weakest. In a world that grows louder by the day, that awareness becomes increasingly valuable. Noise will always dominate attention. Fragility will always determine outcomes.